All right, yeah, thank you very much for these introductions. Like Charlotte already said, I have a background in neuroscience and I'm now working in data science, and it's been quite an interesting transition. So I would like to share some of the experiences with you and some of the findings where these two disciplines are actually connected. So yeah, my name is Annina Neumann. I'm head of data science at SHS Viveon. We're an IT consultancy company in the field of customer relationship management. So let me start with one very important basic of neuroscience, which is obviously the human brain. So based on lots of research and simulations and neuroimaging and even lesions from certain people in certain brain areas, neuroscientists now divide the brain in sort of four very broad areas, which are called lobes. And I'll start with my personally favorite lobe, the frontal lobe, which is basically in the front, and it's associated with the functions of like reasoning, planning, problem solving, but also with parts of speech, movements, and emotions. Then next, we have the temporal lobe, sort of to the side, which is probably best known for its involvement in memory process and speech, but it's also involved in the perception and recognition of auditory stimuli, for example. Then we have the parietal lobe, which is sort of back here in the back, and it's responsible for recognition of a lot of stuff that has to do with like orientation and movement, but also perception of stimuli in general. And then last but not least, we have the occipital lobe, which is way down here in the back, which is known to be responsible for the basic process of visual processing. So why I decided to sort of start out with all of this is because, as we can already see, the sort of all of these functions that the brain does, they're very similar to the concepts that we try to do in data science when we try to get things or information out of data. We try to sort of teach algorithms or program algorithms the way that they do a lot of the things that actually the brain does. So we're trying to detect patterns. We're trying to sort of reason. We're trying to find the optimal solution to a certain problem. So from that point, it kind of already makes sense to maybe sort of look into neuroscience and the way the brain works as an inspiration for data science or machine learning algorithms. So coming from that perspective, it's actually not very surprising that these two disciplines have been closely connected and intermingled. So today, during the next about 10 minutes, I would just like to tap into some of the examples and go with you through some scenarios and findings where we can actually see why these two concepts, or how basically neuroscience has motivated algorithms and data science. So first, I'm going to start with some very early concepts. So let me start with a sort of a view from classical cognitive science. So it was around 1960s, 1970s, I think, where a very famous theory came up. It was the computational theory of mind. So that theory kind of stated, okay, maybe the brain is just a big computational system. And it was motivated by Alan Turing and the Turing machines and things like finite automata that came up at that point. So basically, like I said, the thought is, okay, the brain is sort of an abstract thing. The mind and thinking means to process certain symbols. You have certain states. Similar to, for example, here, so in finite automata, you have a state. So for example, here you have state 1, and then you have a certain input, and then you can do a certain action. So if you're in state 1, you get input A, you stay in state 1. If you're in state 1 and you get input B, you switch over to state 2, and so on. So they thought of the mind as a big system like that processes information by sort of logical symbols and manipulations. And then a little later, in the 1980s, about sort of a rival theory came up, and people were saying, all right, let's maybe switch over to not looking anymore that much at theoretical and logical constructs about how the brain works. Let's actually go down and look at how the neurophysiological processes are actually happening in the brain and draw some inspiration from there and see how all that is sort of working. And that's basically how neural networks come about, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. We kind of draw inspiration from knowing that in the brain you have a group of neurons, which are sort of information processing cells that communicate, and from there on, when you have lots of those neurons that are interconnected, you can actually learn and store information. And you can use that in computers to simulate the processes and therefore to learn similar to sort of the brain functioning. So I don't want to spend too much time on the basic of neural networks because I would like to go into a more explicit example, which I personally found really interesting. So there's one big discussion in neuroscience. I mean, there's a lot, but this is a particular one, where the big question is, how does the brain store memories? And there's basically two theories that are being kind of contrasted. So one theory would be memories are stored in a distributed way, which means that for every single different memory, you have lots of neurons that are being activated around the brain, and for every memory, you sort of have a spreaded but very different activation pattern. The other theory is the theory of sparse coding, which means, no, it doesn't really make sense to have like a different pattern for every single memory. You have a certain amount of cells. To the extreme, it would just be one cell, but that's just in theory. So the theory is in sparse coding that you have a very small amount of cells that are sort of responsible for memorizing certain concepts. And when the first discussion it came up, people were saying, well, for example, your grandmother. So what if in the brain you have a certain amount of neurons that are responsible for memorizing the concept of your grandmother? And they would fire every time something was about your grandmother. So you can apply that, and people have actually done that to, let's say, a little cooler context. For example, to very popular figures. Like in this example, I don't know, you probably can't read it, this is Luke Skywalker from Star Wars. So in sparse coding, you would say you have a group of Luke Skywalker cells that fire every single time something is about Luke Skywalker. And the important thing is, it doesn't matter whether you see Luke fighting, or whether you see like a tear or full frontal of his face, or maybe whether you see his written name. It's the concept of Luke Skywalker, so the important thing that they sort of fire to, compared to distributed coding, where you would have, for every single little different memory of Luke Skywalker, you would also have a different distributed coding pattern. And so you can have other concept or sparse cells, for example, for Yoda. And the important thing is that because Yoda and Luke are both Jedi Knights, and so they sort of relate to each other, these cells that are responsible for the cross coding can actually overlap to them because they're related. Not like Jennifer Aniston. So the Jennifer Aniston cells in the brain do not relate to the Luke Skywalker brains because they don't really have anything to do with each other. However, you might actually have some Jennifer Aniston brain cells. So going on from that theory, people were thinking, well, this sparse coding, that's a smart thing, because what if it happens like that in the brain, what it does, it's a very efficient way of feature encoding. So you don't have to encode every single little memory, you just encode the very important concepts. So that has been applied in actually lots of machine learning algorithms, and also therefore in data science, because it's proven to be very helpful when you have kind of like noisy and complex stimuli, like natural scenes, pictures of natural scenes, or auditory stimuli. So there it's used very well for the feature encoding, because there you can say, okay, maybe it makes more sense to encode an image, not by every single little pixel, but by the important information, feature information in the image, like edges, for example. So the neural network would only encode the edges, and therefore it's a lot more efficient in sort of processing algorithms like that. And also in deep learning, where we have different algorithms that are usually sort of stacked on top of each other in a hierarchical way, you often have at the very beginning an own model that's used to learn input features from the data. So you don't sort of engineer it like you do it in regular networks where you engineer input features. You have one model that's actually learning the input features from the data. And for a concept like that, it's very, very good to use the sparse coding, or the concepts that have arisen from sparse coding, because it's such an efficient way and it's proven to work very well in algorithms like that. All right, so just to wrap up, I would like to point out another sort of area where neuroscience or cognitive science has inspired algorithms and data science. And this one, in some way, even goes more back than the other one. So this is about reinforcement learning algorithms. So it goes back all the way to behaviorism. I'm sure you've all heard of behaviorism, you know, Skinner and the rats experiments, where rats have to sort of push a lever to get some food and things like that. So the concept behind behaviorism is that you sort of, well, reward behavior, which you think is good behavior or is positive behavior, and you sort of punish behavior that is not wanted sort of in that situation. And I don't know if any of you actually watched The Big Bang Theory, but there's quite an interesting episode where they actually pick up on that subject, which is quite funny because in that episode, Sheldon tries to make a better Penny by applying this operant conditioning. So he's rewarding her with chocolates, which you can see in this picture, every time she does something he thinks is right. And actually, in the end, I think he ends up spraying water at people when he thinks that they're eliciting behavior that he doesn't want to see. So it's, a very broad concept, very, very well known. And it's also been applied lots of times in algorithms. So in reinforcement learning algorithms, they pick up on this concept, and what they actually do, it's stated up here. So the question here is, how should an agent take actions in an environment so that it can maximize its cumulative rewards? This is a bit of a different situation because here the agent actually decides every single time, what am I going to do? What's the best action now to do to actually maximize the reward? So I've come a very interesting application of a few weeks ago, which is actually in dynamic pricing. So for example, in dynamic pricing, you can use the Q-learning algorithm, which is very famous for reinforcement learning. So what was happening there is people applied the Q-learning algorithm to decide in every situation, when you have like a ticket, for example, what's the optimal price for that ticket now with regards to how many tickets I've left, when's the, the event or the flight, whatever, when does it take off, and then actually pick the optimal price to, at the end, maximize the revenue in this case. So these algorithms are also being applied in quite a lot of situations. And just to point that out, it gets really interesting when you combine them with things like neural networks, for example. So in a reinforcement algorithm, you can now sort of replace the agent with a neural network. And that way the neural network learns the functionings, and you have the states that the agent is in sort of as the input, and the outputs the neural network then calculates are the optimized actions based on the rewards. All right, so just to wrap up, I hope I could at least give a glimpse or give some ideas of where certain concepts from neuroscience are used in certain algorithms and data sciences. So personally, I think that actually both disciplines are still quite an inspiration to each other because it's just really helpful to sort of think about how do things work in the brain, but then it's also very helpful nowadays for neuroscience that you can simulate things and that you can try out things in a computer. So both of them are really, really closely connected. And very important for me also is to say that in neuroscience, it's not really about right and wrong because we don't know that much about the brain yet. Like, for example, sparse coding and distributed coding. You don't have to find a solution to say, okay, this is completely right and the other one is just not happening, it's completely wrong. That's not what it's all about. It's about finding inspiration and thinking about different concepts and how they work and then applying them on sort of real life data and business data. And some of the concepts might actually work quite well. Some of them are not, but it's not about right or wrong. It's just about getting new algorithms to find interesting things. And there's still a lot more open. There's so many interesting questions, especially when you come to mind and acting agents and the free will, and how do we actually do that in computers? How does a computer actually make optimal decisions? Do we have there's also a big discussion in neuroscience about the homunculus, who's supposed to be a little guy who's in the brain. So the question is, who kind of draws the strings there? So when it comes to situations like that, there's really still so much more, I think, that we can explore in both disciplines. Right, that was it. Thank you very much.